can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. It will only be myself in this episode. I wanted to use this episode as an opportunity to elaborate, I think, on a topic that comes up quite commonly when I'm working with coaches, particularly grassroots coaches, although the issue is also prevalent as well within sort of performance focused spheres as well. The topic is around being a coach to your own child. So, you'll know that, particularly again, community sport, the vast majority of those that are involved are volunteers. They're parents of the children who are there. The reason for being there, amongst other things, and we'll get into that, is to just facilitate organised sport at that level, where there are, of course, certain restrictions on funding or just general resourcing in terms of, the manpower, the women power, to have volunteers present. So, you get lots of mums and dads try to do their best, and they are doing their best, and it's amazing. And I feel like in the short opportunities that I have to speak to these sorts of groups of people, that they really want to speak at length around some of the issues that they experience there, and just for different reasons I haven't always had the opportunity to give that conversation as much of a platform as I would like to do. So I think this might be a good opportunity here to do that, and maybe just raise a bit of awareness for the plight that is being the coach of your own child. I think there's quite a popular rhetoric around coach's child, and that wee boy's going to have it easy because his dad's the coach, or just or she's going to have it easy because her mum's the coach. And well, we'll get into what some of the maybe some positives can be for that child. It is absolutely false, in my opinion, that and based on the research I'm going to share with you today, part research that I've done myself from my PhD research, but also where I can give reference to other work in a while. It's a hard job being the kid of one of your coaches. It is tough. So we're going to chat a little bit around that, and as I've just kind of mentioned there, this is to help sort of share some of my own work. So I carried out a PhD look at influences on coach behaviours. So I'm quite deterministic, I think. I believe there are certain mechanistic influences in the way that we as coaches behave that are still to some extent within our control, and I won't get into a whole sort of philosophical argument about free will and are we really ever in control of our behaviours, but at a sort of local level anyway, if we want to say that, there are strong influences on coach behaviours. And I believe it's really important that we interrogate those influences, because the only way that we can reach self-awareness of ourselves is often by understanding ourselves better. And I would then also speak at a sort of coach development level. I think hearing the voices of those at the sort of co-face of coaching, and it can be really helpful. So sort of building up that sort of bottoms-up approach to coach education, where we're really looking at what do people struggle with. And we're actually then using that as the impetus for here's what we can do to help with that. or even using that as the sort of spark to then design perhaps wider programs that again pay attention to those issues. So where it's maybe influences that are then resolved at the grounds level in terms of locally within a club or at a more national governing body level, then that's beside the point. It's trying to kind of shine a light on that. My research was also sort of underpinned by a psychological theory known as self-determination theory. We'll give a very brief kind of whistle-stop tour on what this means, what it entails. Not because I'm trying to shroud it in mystery, but I just don't think for practical reasons it's hugely beneficial to get too wrapped up in the technical terminology of all those things. I'm just going to be sharing today insights that are kind of a bit more bare and a bit more easy, I think, in a lot of ways to sort of understand and just to take note of, and then we can interpret it somewhat with this theory in mind, but also perhaps with other theories or other working knowledge in mind that we maybe use as a coach, as a crew, that we don't need to necessarily attach a category to. So yeah, very very briefly, and I say this, and forgive me because when I say briefly sometimes and then actually go off on a tangent, but self-determination theory, it sort of posits that the reasons for why an individual takes part in an activity and the meaning that they assign to their participation within that activity can have big implications for the outcomes that they derive as a product of their participation. So we would often, in most of the research, and not just within sort of sports coaching spheres, where comparatively speaking, it's actually a fairly new framework. It's across the last 20 or so years, but in education and health, these sorts of settings, ever since the 1980s when the theory was first coined, we've had a lot of evidence to show that where individuals are motivated primarily by more internally driven reasons, that might be, and again, I'm not going to go into the technical terminology here too much, but that could be for just the pure interest or fun of doing the activity, or it could be because you see that your participation in the activity is being a product of your identity in some way, or that you attach some sort of value to the activity. So if the activity itself may not in itself be, and as you might say, intrinsically motivating, that there's a value you could do in it that's that you do still attach meaning to and that sort of thing. Obviously, we don't all get motivated by purely internal drivers. There are also external drivers. There's the carrot and stick. There's the sort of self-induced, or no, sorry, maybe better said, externally induced guilt, where it's there's an externally there's an internal driver that's been externally placed, sometimes that might be through a significant other of some sort or some sort of other external actor, maybe making you feel that you should do something, in which case that can be quite a powerful motivator to continue to do it. You don't want to let people down, all the way down to across the other end of the spectrum where we call this sort of amotivation, where there's just a passivity to our participation in events. There's a sort of feeling of helplessness, and it's not. And I just say that because we don't necessarily know why we're doing it. We're just doing it. We go through the motions. You might hear that sort of thing. So, and again, I suppose maybe I shouldn't. Yeah, for those that are curious, that what I've given there is a very quick description of a spectrum of motivation types. And there is some, and this, as I say, it's because self-determination theory is a meta theory. There's a lot of individual theories that help make it up. For those that are interested in that sort of thing, we would call this a combination of cognitive evaluation theory, which looks kind of mostly intrinsic versus sort of extrinsic motives, but we can sort of stretch them out across that continuum that I've just shown, and using another theory that's called organismic integration theory. Don't need to really know what that means. It's just I just say that in case people have an interest and they want to look further at that. Now, being practical, going back to it, we don't need to all have we don't need to have purely internal drivers. It's not realistic to presume that we would. People do activities for a whole host of reasons. People take part in sport, more contextually speaking, for a whole host of reasons. But what self-determination theory would posit, and what a lot of the evidence that's been collected around this would support, is that where our motivations for taking part in activity are mostly internally driven. Okay, I mean, there can be externally driven reasons as well, but where there are mostly internally driven reasons, we are more likely to elicit healthy outcomes. Okay, that could be in terms of the effort that we put into it. It can be in terms of just our general persistence in that activity. It could be in terms of within a sports sphere, more specifically speaking. We've even seen things around their sort of moral etiquette in terms of sportsmanship. Actually, performance improvements have also been found as a result of this sort of space, and there's also just a general increase in health and well-being. And I'm sure you can kind of appreciate where, you know, you've maybe, if you've not experienced this yourself, you've heard of other people who are in sport for their own reasons, and, you know, athletes that longer term go on to suffer depression and other sorts of things like that. So it's kind of getting into that aspect. Now, the reason another big part of self-determination theory is the link between our motivation types. Because again, we need to not think about motivation as being just an amount. It's not something that we have more. We aren't motivated and demotivated. People think of it in those very binary terms, and there's more nuance to that. Everyone's motivated. But it's what are you motivated by? So self-determination deals with types and amounts of motivation. So we need to see things in that sort of way. The quality of motivation is just as, if not more important than the quantity. And what self-determination theory also puts a lot of sort of importance on is meeting people's psychological needs. The reason why we would want to meet someone's psychological needs insofar as trying to foster more adaptive forms of motivation and therefore maybe hopefully elicit better outcomes is because if we think about the prototypical type of motivation. So if we know that that intrinsic form of motivation is the purest and perhaps most useful, as far as most of the evidence would say, form of motivation, someone won't want to do an activity long term and for the pure fun and enjoyment if they don't feel that they have some sort of self-control over it. And the reason I say that is because one of our three basic psychological needs, and there's three basic ones as it stands and counting. There are now some candidates emerging across wider research in this area to include other needs, but the theories we know it currently: the need for autonomy. We need to feel in control of our behaviour. We need to feel that our behaviour is volitional and self-expressive. And if you think about how, if you're going to do something for the pure fun and love and enjoyment, you should feel some form of control over the activity. We also wouldn't really want to do an activity for that as intrinsic a reason if we didn't feel like we were getting better at it in some respect, if we didn't feel like we were capable of having or achieving some form of mastery within the activity. And that's where competence becomes the second psychological need, the fundamental needs that again, it's not just sport participants, it's not just coaches, it's all people in all walks of life are said to have this. These are basic fundamental human needs that need to be met. And then there's also the sort of need for relatedness, which is as social beings, we want to feel connected to other people. We want to actually also have the opportunity to care for other people by all standards. So, and these aren't just important in terms of making up those who are already intrinsically motivated, but we would also argue that even those that are maybe perhaps motivated by more external reasons, a big part in the internalisation of our motivations, from moving from an ideal scenario, more external reasons, to a more internal motivational orientation, often is because over time we feel we can develop a sense of mastery, and over time we want to perhaps continue to cultivate closer and closer relationships with people. And you'll know yourself, I mean, I've had this in the past where I've done, like, you know, football festivals, or when I was working in the community and those sorts of like camps types, you know, events, you would have that a few kids that would come and they just can't wait to play football or play their sport. But there's also the kids that are dragged out of the car. Now there's very different motivations happening there. Okay, you know, the kids that are dragged out of the car are very much there because they're going to get grounded if they don't do it. Now, over time, let's say across that week, you start to coach that child. They start to actually get better at the activity. You actually start to have little jokes with that kid. They start to trust you and enjoy spending time with you. Perhaps as a result of that, they actually start to engage in the activity more self-determined, you know, more volitionally. Or indeed, perhaps there's even that kid who came along and they do try hard straight from the start, and it's not necessarily because of your coaching, but because their friends play the sport, and again, getting better at the sport is almost attached to being closer to them as well. So they see that as another reason, and again, yeah, external drivers, but they can over time with perhaps enough 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 of you taking optimal advantage of those windows, you can create a feeling that is more self-determined. So that's that idea, okay? And the reason I say that is because when I look at the influences on coach behaviour, I look at factors that influence behaviours that influence the motivational orientation of the sport participant. Okay, now my research was very much contextualised within youth sport, more specifically youth football coaching within Scotland, but again, I think there are transferable qualities to a lot of this stuff across sports and settings. Can't be generalised, and I'll go on exactly why that is the case in a moment, but just to kind of make you conscious of that. And I just say that because from this point onwards, I may offer some sort of light, note back to some of these terms, but very briefly, okay? Because again, I don't want us to feel that this is too cumbersome. Sometimes it points to, and it shifts attention away from just talking about behaviours and just talking about looking after kids and the things that kids might need at different times. And we all know this as coaches implicitly, or at least through the working knowledge that we've developed over time. So yeah. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that. So what I've done as part of my PhD, I was a bit of a annoyance to about 8 coaches working within the grassroots community game in Scotland for many months, okay, and I tracked these coaches, I observed these coaches in practice, I interviewed these coaches over several sessions. I've done a lot of field note analysis, and what we do in research quite often for the people that we aren't as closely connected to that sort of work is after interviews, after observations, I done a thing called thematic analysis, where essentially we sort of look for themes that come out and try and sort of track those themes, and then we discuss it. Okay, so what I'm going to share is, and there was loads of different themes that came out, but one of them was the theme of, and this was the project wasn't necessarily positioned to look purely at the influence of being a parent coach, but it came out, it just couldn't be stopped, it came out that a big influence on the motivational environment that the coach created for the young players was the fact that of this whole idea around being a father or a mother to one or more of these children. Okay, so I'm going to share with you some of these findings, and we'll kind of chunk them up into the themes, and we'll discuss some of these themes one at a time. And I want you to kind of think, if you are that parent who maybe struggles with this, and again, I'm not necessarily present findings that have to encapsulate your reality. It's far from that. These were the coaches' realities. I perform a lot of research with some element of a sort of relativistic ontology, which is that sort of how I see truth. I think it can be locally situated. I think, one parent's truth is different from others, but they're equally valid and sort of bounded by the context in which they were experienced to some extent. And that's a conversation on our time why I say that. But So let's think first and foremost then, and again, it's just sharing stories, and let's see if you can connect with it. And also perhaps just one other thing to add, if maybe you're not so much the parent, but indeed maybe you work with parents as a coach developer, could this perhaps trigger some useful conversation points that you could have with those that are perhaps taking part in your course, or that you work with locally, in terms of maybe you're a coach developer who works on the ground and practice in industry, wherever it is you work. These can be really good starting points in which to cultivate, at the very least, self-awareness initially, and then action afterwards. Okay, because again, why do I think we need to have an interest in influences on coach behaviour? It's because it offers a real potent opportunity for coaches to get better through self-awareness and by taking action on the things that help set them up to coach well, versus the things that actually, help trip them up to coach poorly. So, these are, we want our coaches to create good environments, healthy environments, but are we helping the coach get into the best frame of mind in order to do that? That could be through education, helping them understand things better. It also can be through just general support in terms of helping the coaches be in an environment that's more conducive to get the best out of them as individuals. And in this sort of particular topic, that might even be helping the coaches understand what should and shouldn't be expected of them, and maybe taking the pressure off them in many ways. I think that will become clearer as we start to move through the findings, because there's a difficulty here. This isn't a bad coach in any way, shape or form. This is actually really meaningful, well-intended coaches that I worked with, and I just want to share some of their stories, because I think it's actually a real shame that this is something that I think so many coaches in different ways deal with, but in a similar way, and it's part of the intimate relationship and the familial relationship that they share with some of those that take part in their sessions, not just for the coach but also for that at times poor kid that has to navigate that space as well with their mum and dad. It's very complicated. I'll talk a little bit at the end as well, a little bit about some of the limitations of this work further, and maybe some of the opportunities for where further research might pick it up, for those that are sort of in academia and they maybe want to, they're thinking about a project where they might want to take some of this work next to. There are some interesting avenues in that respect. Okay, cool. Spoke for 20 minutes already, not even got into it there, so that's just how I am. I apologise. So first one, hopes and fears for the child. Okay. And not just actually for the child, but for the child-parent relationship. So one of the things that there are a good few things that the coaches spoke to me about here. Let's think about hopes. Every parent wants to impart wisdom onto their kid. They want to, be that shining light for their kid, that when their kid grows up, they're successful in life, and the parent wants to feel that they've had a real part to play in that by instilling good lessons on them. Okay, there was a real tendency towards that sort of life coach element as the father, and I must say, actually, just in order to sort of situate these findings, and again going into it already, one of the limitations, this was purely men that were coaching their sons. So this isn't necessarily reflective of mothers coaching their sons or mothers coaching their daughters. So just so that we can keep that, stay aware of that. But with the male coaches that I did work with, they either wanted to cultivate, two examples here, the importance of that sort of growth mindset and trying whatever they could do to talk not just to their kid but by an extension, and this was because often as a byproduct of their behaviour towards the kid, they wanted it to also, or if they didn't necessarily actively want it, they did, but it would normally also affect the other children that are in their company. It was about growth mindset and going, you need to try hard, and you need to look at these Scotland players and look what they have done. And that was them speaking to their child. They wanted their child to pick up on that. There was also the nuance of, and I found this quite interesting, where some of the parents were harsher on their child, and it was because they felt like they had to put some sort of artificial pressure on them because their home life was very comfortable, and they knew that intimately, obviously, as being part of that, but they felt for their kids' wider character development, sport maybe represented a space where they could, challenge them further in a way that perhaps they aren't being challenged elsewhere. Okay, there was also now moving on to this sort of idea of parental freedoms. That was something that came up quite a lot, and it again linked back to the hopes that some of these parent coaches had for their kids. I was speaking to a coach, and they mentioned around they understood the importance of inclusivity, for example, and why they feel like participation is really important. Trying hard and participate, equal game time, all those sorts of things, or just validating children's effort wherever that effort perhaps stands, comparatively speaking. They accepted that for other children, and they followed through on that expected societal behaviour. Okay. However, they did take out certain parental freedoms when it came to their own child. So, where a parent might, to the wider group, voice and show value of, that everyone's a winner, but actually privately to their own child, they would communicate that there are winners and losers, and that, losing a match and so forth, that should be recognised. That they were prone to doing that. And again, that came, and if it wasn't even that sort of parental freedom, there was also the freedom to be more of a disciplinarian towards their child, and in terms of the what they would say to their child, and some of these things also mixed in with sort of hypersensitivity that they had towards them, but we'll get into that later on. But these were parental freedoms, okay, in ways to act that whereas they were more inhibited in perhaps the way they would act towards other people's children, because it isn't their child, and actually a lot of the coaches had quite an intimate understanding of how they wouldn't act towards someone else's child the way that they would dislike someone to act towards their own child. So it was funny in that way, the way that this sort of thing worked out. Other players' experiences were just a byproduct. The big reason for why they were there. And I think if you asked a lot of parents that they have coached their child, at least initially, they're there for their child. And if perhaps it's at the start of that journey, if their child stopped playing for a team, many parents would just then stop volunteering for that. Of course, many parents also actually continue to, and it's amazing that they do that, just that they've been embedded in that environment for so long, and they want to give back to that community that served their own child. But there was a quite a strong feeling in the coaches that I worked with that it was very much like the reason they're there is for their child, and it was the strongest motivator for being there. So that was just one of the things they wanted to do. They wanted to be closer to their child through sport. There was also the sort of legacy of being a parent coach player for coaching, okay, in terms of the influence it then has on coaching, because many of the parents that were coaching in the teams that I observed had been coached as players themselves by their own parents. And it was funny because that in some ways was a reason for fear, for the negative impact that it could have on their parent-child relationship rather than coach-athlete. One of the coaches mentioned about, he'd had conversations with his own father around what it was like when they were younger, and they argued a lot. They came home, they would talk to each other, and it made him, as a result, very shy towards, it was twofold. It made him want to really enhance the relatedness, the sense of connection and feeling of caring towards his boy when he's coaching, and that sort of manifested itself in a couple of different ways, from maybe deliberately not after the game, when that sometimes for the child, that sort of tumultuous walk back to the car, what's it going to be like when you go back to the car, what's dad going to say then, that he would be very prone to not instigating that conversation, and try to be supportive as he can be in those quite sensitive moments. Also, and this was, and my recall's failing me slightly, but looking back at my notes here, if it wasn't that parent, there was also other parents who would be shy towards even calling out certain things with their kid, and I mean even just in terms of like feedback, competency-based feedback, okay, like how they're doing in the match, because they didn't want to run the risk of it being taken personally and then it coming and following into their home life. Now there's implications there, isn't there? Because as a coach, we want to, as part of offering structure within our environment, which again I'm now thinking about self-determination theory briefly, is a real conducive ingredient to helping players have better and perhaps more adaptive motivation towards getting better and also staying in the activity. They want to feel like they have information that they can use to help them get better, while at the same time feeling like they are already to some extent good as it is. So what some of the coaches were prone to doing is they would do one part of that. They would make the kid feel good when they were playing, but wherever there was actually a performance or an opportunity for the kid to learn, they would be quite shy to actually give that feedback. Now, in many ways, that can be quite difficult, and that's problematic. It can be unhelpful for the kid if you're not actually giving them advice to help them get better in that moment. And perhaps if you then eventually do, they've lost the opportunity to receive it in a space where they might be able to then put it back into practice and make an impact on the end outcome, or so on and so forth. Or you've missed out on having that real tangible picture around them as well. So there was some implications straight away then for their behaviours as a coach, and it had consequences for their effectiveness as a coach versus their effectiveness as a parent. And this is this conflict that was just coming up. So that was a little bit about hopes and fears for the child. The next big topic that came out was actually using the kid as a coaching tool. Now this was really interesting, and again, maybe it resonates with yourself, where there's a lot of insider information that coaching your own child can help you get access to. If it wasn't the coaches asking their sons after training, how did you enjoy the practice? Was it good? Was it not so good? Could we get better? There was also sort of getting information about the sort of the intra-team relationships, so player-to-player relationships and those sort of more relational dynamics. That again was quite interesting. So I'll give one example of this. There was a dispute between some players that one of the coaches managed to glean through their kid telling them. That otherwise you wouldn't have been privy to that information, as much as we can sometimes say as coaches who are observant. That players will speak and sometimes we can miss things, but it was only because of being a parent to one of the kids that this coach was able to understand and find out information around that. And that sounds like that's quite a good point. Then that sounds like you could have done some stuff that could have helped with that or whatever. But then one of the coaches also spoke actually about the real conflict then of whether to use that information, how to act upon that information, because then it leads itself into a whole maze of potential outcomes whereby the coach should act on the information, sort it, everything's fine, or the coach should act on that information and maybe it's not correct information and it doesn't go well. Okay, maybe it's distorted somewhat, or based on maybe the other kid's particular relationship with other people in their team. Maybe in another scenario, and this is one of the ones that came up quite tangibly, was what if you act on that information, you sort it or whatever, but the information gets traced back to your child. Your child gets outed as being a bit of a mole within a team, and how would that then affect that child's relationship with other people? Because again, that's something as parents we're going to think about. As coaches, well-meaning coaches, we're always going to think about our participants' relationships with other people. Self-determination theory helps us understand the real importance of that. If there's one thing that's true, if there's one thing that's true, that the coach-created motivational environment, it's sometimes pale in comparison in terms of its relative importance to the peer-created motivational environment, like kids and how kids feel towards their teammates and the way that their teammates make them feel. They're massively powerful reasons and for maybe why they perhaps, or how they see themselves in participating in that activity, what reasons they attach to it, whether they do it volitionally, whether they do it for intrinsic reasons versus more external reasons, extrinsic reasons even. And there's one of the coaches mentioned about the worry of that, and this was because it was also tied back into a little bit around, and this is another way that we might even see a bit of parent-child collaboration, whereby where maybe one of your kids, your son, or might, again, let's speak to the wider audience, your daughter, maybe they're new to the team, or maybe they want to make friends in the team, and in some ways, being the parent coach, you can manufacture opportunities for them to do that, whether it be pairing them up with people who perhaps you feel that child would be on with better than others, or even just having more of a social feel to the session rather than as technical, tactical, that sort of thing, because you're trying to press onus on that social aspect? Did you feel that's more important for your son or daughter before you think of it so much about the team, what the team needs? So we've seen those sorts of things happening as well. But again, that just shows how it can also collide with how you actually use insider information as well. So there's lots of complexities there, which was really interesting and difficult to navigate. These are conundrums. And again, I just say that because I think that's a real first opportunity to have empathy for what we may flippantly see as only benefits. They're actually like there's nuance to this, and we need to be cognizant of that. So another thing, and this is something that was really big, was hypersensitivity. Not just from the parent coach to their child's actions, but also hypersensitivity to others' perceptions of their behaviours. There was at times a real sort of performative aspect to the coach's behaviours, which I found really intriguing. And it was almost like acting through their interactions with their child in order to send a message to other players and to parents that they aren't favouritising them. And it's a real shame, because like it went so far the other way that it was just, I've seen situations where you would see, I've heard it as well, not just from that, but just from my time as a coach developer as well, and working with parents and those sorts of things, where, your wee man's just took the ball past 3 people and scored, and there's nothing, there's silence. But then, the wee man should have passed the ball, but he didn't, and all of a sudden there's an eruption because it's like, why are you not doing that, and so on and so forth. And it's like, parents are in the moments wanting to say, well done, you done some good parts there, but they're just so worried about how people latch onto that. And interestingly as well, it's not even like a fear that at all times is externally driven. It's an internal suspicion of themselves almost. It's like, for a lot of the coaches, you would then ask them, well, how are the parents? And they're like, parents are great. They're great parents. They've never given me that impression that they feel favouritised. So it's like it's an internal pressure that a lot of parent coaches put on themselves. And I just say that because at times maybe you need to recognise that people see your character and they know your values, and and they trust you in sort of parity of behaviour, and again we need to sometimes double check. I always think we need to fact check. I think come back to, there was an earlier episode that I recorded around the need to be reflexive as a coach. We reflect on things, but what the end outcome and end sense making that we arrive at sometimes isn't legitimate, and we need to fact check that, and that's where reflexive thought comes into it, and that's just one scenario where that might be the case. So we've seen a lot of things like that, and that could also manifest itself in the amount of game time offered. It can manifest itself in terms of how publicly praise is given, and I say this, and this was something that came out, and I think this is something we need to be so careful as for parent coaches, is that there was always that I won't give the praise now because at home I can give it, or in the car I can give it. So on the stage in front of the parents, I'll be this kind of stone like face, and I'll praise other kids. I won't necessarily do it for my own boy or girl, but when they get back in the car, then we'll well done, brilliant, that was amazing. Or we go home, I'll go out the room and say, well done today, that was amazing. And a lot of coaches were saying that they've done that, but again, the implications of that are you've missed a real opportunity for a kid to feel that competent support in the moment, to not just help the performance they're already in, but also to really maximise the sort of feel good factor they get from getting public applause. There's nothing better if you think back to when you were a sport participant and you had a really good game. See if when it was half time or full time, or even at the end of training or during training, and in front of your peers, in front of your teammates, your mum or dad then goes, well done, that was really good. It's like, just because they're your child doesn't mean they don't still need sometimes public validation. That's a really important thing. I would actually, and one, this is a very brief segue, but is a wider influence on coach behaviour praise and when to give praise and when not to. There's a lot of trip ups in this regard, like other coaches and also the same coaches within my PhD also spoke a little bit about where when players are deemed to be of better quality and more able than other players, there's that inclination towards giving them praise maybe more privately, whereas the weaker players are given praise more publicly. And I'm like, that's a real shame for the players that are of better standard at the moment, because these are the sorts of hiccups that all of a sudden there's a depletion in learning and actually a plateau in the progress that maybe your better players were making because you've stopped making them feel good. Or maybe, because some people would neglect even giving them praise. They feel like, they know they're good already. And it's like, you can't always count on that. So that and I just say that because that's a wider issue, I think, going beyond just the general subtopic of being a parent coach and thinking about this through the prism of as your child, thinking of this as just your sport participant and thinking about how that, how we apportion praise or not is important. And we consider motivation and those sorts of things and I think that's one of the things self-determination theory helps us understand a little bit better. So there was that aspect in it. There was also, and this is sort of like an influence on the influence sometimes in terms of why we can, or at least why the coaches were shown to be hypersensitive, and it was one of the reasons that they gave was an emotional investment in their child's learning and performance, because whereas for every hour that everyone else in their team is giving coaching by them, they give about 4 times that coaching to their own child, because being a parent coach, you aren't just, for the best of times, I'm not trying to again presume what your experience could be in this respect, but for some, however you want to deem that, it's not just coaching on the park, it's coaching in the house before, as we're getting ready. There's coaching in the car journey on the way to the training session. There's coaching in the training session, there's coaching after the training session. And one of the things that the coaches spoke about on a match day, for example, was that because there was an investment in towards giving more and more guidance and advice on the route to the game, coupled with the fact that they're their parents, so there's an emotional component that this sort of manifested in behaviour that was really hypersensitive, because they perceived themselves to be putting in so much more work that to not see at least equal returns on that investment was frustrating to many of the parent coaches. And I would just then, and I raised that point as maybe an opportunity to consider the fact that your son or daughter will also recognise that increased investment, and you could so imagine how pressurising that could be, knowing that you're not just taking them to the game, you're not just setting up the opportunity for them to play by coaching them, you're also giving them all this additional coaching. Like that's in many ways a burden to that child, and I don't say this with anything again other than absolute praise for parent coaches that do that, but it's just in recognising that you can't necessarily avoid that you are doing it just by virtue of the fact that you are creating a space and facilitating play and all these amazing things, that you might want to take opportunities where you can to relax that pressure that maybe your child could feel because they just can't help but see the heightened investment that you have. But that's just 2 ways of taking it, thinking about how you can minimise that feeling in your child, but also just be appreciative of that potential influence that is on you and your own behaviours. So it was just interesting when the coaches were speaking about that the emotional investment was a reason for why they were triggered at times. There was also, and this is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, the coach would often speak around where they were hypersensitive towards disrespect from the child in a coaching space, because there was always that worry of, because the child, knows that you're their dad, in terms of the coaching in this study, that the child feels empowerment towards being able to say certain things to you that they maybe otherwise wouldn't, that they maybe otherwise wouldn't say to other coaches. And preempting that, there was a lot of behaviours and gestures made to sort of preempt and try and nullify these things before they even occurred, if they were ever going to occur. So it was like, we might even, and there was cases where we seen and it was funny, it showed how parent coaches sometimes work with each other in that respect, and where perhaps they go, do you know what, this, my boy, or isn't cooperating, I can't take this further, can you actually help with this? Because that also happened, and they were kind of shown to be working in like partnerships with each other. So it wasn't you needing to dish out the handbook, it was someone else. But in other circumstances, and I seen it happen. Well, not even other circumstances, but it's part of one scenario where one parent child, I think, made a gesture towards them, and they went up to another parent coach and said, look, you need to deal with this, please, for me, that sort of thing. I need to remove myself from this. That at the point of then apprehending the behaviour, there was also a preemptive prompt towards that coach's own child, to recognise that when we're playing sport, that I'm not your dad, I'm your coach. And it's like, because of that, don't be surprised potentially if there's a rebellion towards that behaviour where it's felt unjustified, because at that time that coach was meant to be reprimanding behaviour from another coach's child, but that coach felt it was useful to also at the same time preemptively tell off their own child in terms of when addressing the wider group. And what the reason I say that is, and what I mean by a self-fulfilling prophecy is, and this is a factor that's been researched quite a lot within the coach created motivational environment, where we talk around where coaches' perceptions of a player's own motivation can in turn influence their behaviour towards them, which exacerbates or at least changes towards the motivation type that they initially appraised, whether or not it was right or wrong to do so. So, I see, if I've got a kid and I'm coaching them and I presume that they're going to be disrespectful and I forewarn them not to be disrespectful, I am in turn then giving them in trouble. That kid then actually takes that to heart. That kid then acts less compliant as a result. That in turn further cements in my mind that is an issue I need to continue to deal with. I continue to preempt, I continue to reprimand, and it's whereas maybe the situation wouldn't have occurred had you perhaps been a bit more trusting in that relationship. And I don't say this in any sort of, and I don't mean for this isn't meant to be a tell parent coaches how to do better. As you've already seen, this is just really demonstrating how tough this is, because there are also times where you do need to reprimand, I'm sure, your own child, but it's like, can you choose when to do it when it's a legitimate moment to do it, and not where you're just assuming that there's some sort of undertone that maybe might not be there in reality. So that was something that was quite interesting. The last finding that I want to speak to, and it was interesting and quite common in the coaches that I observed, was parenthood as coach education. And this had some pros and negatives. So because all these coaches were dads far longer than they were coaches, and they're going into a space working with young people where the most easy to attach and their anchor point was the hard miles they've done as a parent, because that's dealing with a kid. So naturally they're going to bring lessons forward from the home and how they've worked with their kid into a coaching sphere as a sort of starting point, and a bit of an extra kick forward. And this works out okay at times if the methods that you use at home are appropriate and effective and useful, perhaps, for cultivating adaptive means of motivation, and or just it's just even taken away from that, just in terms of generally speaking, being a good coach and a good person towards the kid and the wider group. I've seen instances, for example, where at the start of the session it'd be like deliberately saying, look, if we do this, we might get a game, we might, and emphasising that word, we might. And if the kids say, can we, say we might. And it was only afterwards when I asked the coaches these sorts of, why they were doing these sorts of things. It's like, at home, in the house, I don't ever say we will. I always say we might, to make sure that they behave properly. You know, we might watch a film after dinner if you eat your dinner up, that sort of thing. And it was interesting to see how they would carry that sort of strategy forward, because it was effective. Now, that's why the behaviour is right or wrong. We can dispute this, and there are, by the way, and it's a conversation for another time, I've got a lot of issues with self-determination theory sometimes. I think there's limitations to it, there's flaws within it, at least in the way that it's communicated and represented at times. But that's a conversation another time. And I just say that because, to play devil's advocate there, I could be saying that actually using the stick isn't always the best strategy for longer term adherence to certain behaviours and things like that, because much like at the home, where the kid's only going to eat their dinners because they've been given the bribe of being able to watch a film afterwards. Who's to say then in a training session that kids aren't only behaving in a good way, or whatever you deem as good, because you're now bribed them with a game at the end. We would want players to want to behave in a light that you feel is appropriate. We want them to control their own behaviour. Self-determination theory is trying to set up an environment where players motivate themselves, and you're not the external motivator for them at all times. So, and this is just a nice example of where we see those sorts of behaviours coming in, and those behaviours can be debated. But more importantly for me, I just want to spread awareness for how parent coaches can bring behaviours from the home into coaching. But sometimes it's in a really good way. So a lot of the coaches, where they had really empathetic understanding and patience with players, a lot of times it came from understanding their own child's needs, being patient with their own child, understanding their own child's struggles and their own child's wider influences on them. You know, that they see that, you know, their own kids came in from school some days, had a really bad day at school, that influences how they are, it influences when they go to football. So a lot of the coaches actually spoke to being very empathetic, very patient, because of their education as a parent that helped them in some way educate themselves for coaching. So that was really, really good, and that also carried forward to, and one of the examples given was sort of like where, you know, I've went this is me, I'm saying one of the coaches talking about how they'd went to a parents' night at school with maybe a new teacher for their kid, and maybe it was only a couple of months that they knew them, and they would give an appraisal. There's been times where they've given an appraisal of their kid that they didn't feel was accurate, and it came from just from a lack of familiarity with the child, and they knew that over time that would change, and as they become more acquainted, they would understand them better, and they would actually carry that mindfulness of knowing that I might be wrong with them as well when they coached, and they would be more prone to actually collaborating with parents to find out about their little one, and to check their understanding their kid fully. And that was only through having that lived experience that the coaches said of having their own child misjudged, that they had that empathy. So that is, you know, and I say that because there's a lot of good things that can come out of this. You know, there's a lot of reasons for why being a parent who coaches your own child can make you a very good coach. It's not just that it's going to make you hypersensitive. It's not just that it's going to make you constantly anxious. It actually can really set up a good, healthy environment with a healthy amount of self-awareness accompanying our behaviour. So that was something that was that came through quite a lot as well. So looking across those things, hopefully that's starting to kind of show the real importance of understanding a little bit more about ourselves as coaches, and in just one light, okay, being a parent is tough. Being being the athlete of a parent is massively tough. And it's not a problem it's not a small problem, because we know that, as I say, recreational sports mostly run by volunteers. I mean, there was a study done. I mean, this is back in 2010, but it's just one example. But I would definitely presume that these types of statistics are going to be commonplace. There was a study done by Busser and Carivers, and they found that 90% of 141 football coaches that they surveyed were coaching their own child. Okay, so that's a large proportion, and if we can't generalise that, but if we were to, just for the purpose of the conversation, if we were to push that towards a wider, population size, you could imagine there's maybe some level of similarity in that respect if we're still keeping it within grassroots sports, because of just the way that it's set up for that. It's set up for parents to take the lead on things, and I think if you are a parent, I think you should really, if you aren't already thinking about this, I think you should kind of have that honest conversation with yourself about how you act and why you act the way you act towards your kid versus other people in your team, and start to work through these things, because I think a lot of us probably are aware of these things, but we haven't interrogated enough to bring it just to the closer to the front of our minds. Because it's only when we get these things and have these difficult conversations that you're then going to need to expose yourself to, that when it gets to the front of your mind for longer, you're getting more reason to do better. Okay? But also, I say this as a means of actually taking it easy on yourself. I think if, hopefully, as you've seen here, there is a whole bunch of reasons, equal reasons, for why it's tough being in your position. And I think this is where wider support can be had, in terms of maybe, and this might be something that you can help with yourself directly, or other people, if you make them aware of it, can help indirectly with, in terms of the culture that you're part of, in terms of ensuring that other parent coaches that are volunteering within those spaces also feel that, they aren't expected to act in a disparaging way towards their kid in order to show an impartiality, that there's an acceptance. There is. How can a parent be fully impartial? Like, honestly, it doesn't mean however that parent can't also do a good job. It's just a tension that has to exist. But maybe as a coach developer that's around you, they could be working to better support you in that regard through training and support in different ways. And I think for me, and I've always sort of spoken to the importance of this, working from the ground up in that respect is really, really key. If you have coaches that you work or manage in some sense, and again, and I'm not, this isn't just, this is going beyond my study, we're just thinking speculatively a little bit more, at least I am right now, about in other spheres, because I've been in academy settings where there's parents that coach their own kid. I could imagine that's a double whammy of potential hypersensitivity, because the selection processes within those environments and perhaps the progression of a child through those environments has got far more riding on it at times, because that could be to become a professional athlete. So, and parents will be very judgmental at times, and again, it can sometimes be even an opportunity for parents to recognise when actually, just because a kid in your son or daughter's team has a coach coaching them who's also their parent, doesn't mean that kid hasn't went through because they deserve to go through. It's not just that it's because their dad's the coach or their mum's the coach. They've also done things well. So there's a hypersensitivity, I think, for the observing parent that we could also help to work around that as well. So and I think it's just relationship building and getting a bit of trust across the environment in that respect too. So I won't talk more on that, because that's going outside of own findings. We're just kind of having a bit of a suggestive chat now. It's an area that requires further analysis, I think, further research, as I mentioned before, it'd be really interesting to know how a mother who coaches their own son or daughter, if that has any bearing, I think, for example. That'd be quite interesting. It'd be interesting to know how these things unfold in different environments, in different sports. I mean, there's a lot of research. There was some research also done within tennis coaching. Tennis has been a sort of single individual athlete sport. There's where again parents exist. There's just one example when they're working with their kid, but that's a very intimate relationship. Then even more so, and there's maybe not as much. And again, if there's tennis coaches listening, please correct me and put some stuff in the comments to even share your own insight from this, where maybe they don't have as much of a filter for feeling that impact, the player that's affected in their respects. They don't have other peers around them in the same way, or for in some ways, or other coaches perhaps that can balance up that relationship. So again, it'd be really interesting to have future conversations perhaps in this light. But I think, again, where that work has to be taken forward, if you're a sort of budding researcher, then please go and look at this area. I think this is a really interesting area because, and one that's got a lot of practical potential for impact, because it affects so many parent coaches. So many of the coaching demographic are parent coaches. So we need to think about those things and give it some airtime, So, appreciate I've been speaking for an hour there. Hopefully that was informative. Hopefully it got you thinking. And next time you see a parent coaching their own kid, don't think that they have it, that child's got it easy, because they don't. Don't think that coach has got it easy, because they don't. Okay guys, so thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.